Well, ever since the 1930s, humanity has had a moral debate, a moral question, and the question has been, are nuclear weapons, or nuclear reactions, good things or bad things? And it's not necessarily an easy question to answer, because nuclear reactions can produce good things and they can produce bad things, can't they? We see both. You know, the power of nuclear reactions is like nothing we've ever seen or known before in the world. And in the 1930s, what was happening is that scientists were just really fresh in this technology. They didn't understand what they were stumbling into. They began to fire neutrons at kind of super high velocity speeds into very tiny atoms and observe what would happen. And they thought, you know, if we send a neutron into an atom, what will probably happen is that atom will absorb the neutron and the atom will become heavier. It'll become kind of heavier on the periodic table. But nothing was working out. Their observations weren't aligning with the calculations that should have proven that that was true. So in about 1937, a couple of scientists came along and they said, let's look at this a different way. Maybe it's possible that when we're firing a neutron at a crazy high speed and it's hitting an atom, maybe it's actually splitting the atom in half instead of getting absorbed into the atom. Let's test that theory. And when they tested that theory, what they found out was that it proved to be true. When they would take a uranium atom, a very microscopic, tiny little atom, and fire a neutron into it, the atom would split in half. And when it split in half, it would release energy on extraordinary levels. Just huge levels of energy would come out of a little atom being split. Now, this was an exciting breakthrough at the time, because as soon as they figured that out, the next question that got posed was, wait a second, couldn't we create a chain reaction? Like if we fire a neutron into a uranium atom and it splits the atom, shouldn't that atom then spit out its own neutrons? And shouldn't its neutrons be able to split other uranium atoms? And shouldn't they have neutrons to split other uranium atoms? And couldn't we create a chain reaction that gets bigger and bigger and bigger and creates energy on levels we've never even envisioned or imagined was possible before? And sure enough, that's what people figured out to do in the late 1930s. Now, the question then became, are nuclear reactions good things or bad things? Now, you know, on the good side, you may say, well, they're good things. We can create nuclear power. And nuclear power is truly just off the charts amazing in the amount of energy it can produce. We can create nuclear power plants. I heard a podcast not too long ago from a guy who was a Navy submarine commander, and he talked about how all the newest of the naval fleet that's getting built are all getting built with nuclear technology. So at the core of an aircraft carrier, you know, they'll deploy an aircraft carrier. That aircraft carrier will live on for like 50 to 70 years. At its core will be a nuclear reactor, and that reactor produces so much energy that in the life of that aircraft carrier, it will never once have to stop and get fuel, ever in its life. The nuclear reaction, the nuclear chain reaction happening at the core of an aircraft carrier will power it for life. Isn't that crazy? Decades and decades it'll be powered. And so you may say, well, nuclear reactions clearly are a good thing, right? But then you know what happened. Because in the same way that we can create energy to power homes and power cities and get us off of fossil fuels, we can also turn them into bombs. And that's exactly what humanity did. Human beings took these nuclear reactions and turned them into bombs that were so powerful that if dropped on a city, they could have a 22-mile blast radius, meaning everything for 22 miles in every direction gets flattened and destroyed. Isn't that crazy that that's possible? You see, you may think that you came here for a science lesson today at Pathway Community Church. I assure you today is not a science lesson. This is going somewhere. But let me just tell you this before we get there, that I don't think nuclear reactions are good or bad. I think they're morally neutral things. What makes them good or bad is what we choose to do with them. We can use them for good to power things. We can use them to give energy, or we can use them for bad to destroy things. And here's why I tell you that this morning. You may not realize it, but you're walking around every day of your life with a nuclear reactor inside of your mouth. And it's called your tongue. And your tongue, much like a nuclear reactor, can be a good thing or a bad thing. Your tongue, listen, here's the bottom line of today's message. Your tongue is a nuclear reactor. Every day you decide if it gives life or if it takes life. You have this thing in your mouth called your tongue, and off your tongue can roll off words, and the words that roll off your tongue will either give life to people or take life from people. They're going to do one or the other. And every day there's a battle that rages on over who has control of your tongue. Does the Spirit of God have control of your tongue, or does the spirit of the enemy have control of your tongue? Well, this is our 5th and final week of our Twisted Truth series. And today, the message I'm giving you today is the one I've been waiting to speak on. This is the one that I think has the most possibility for influence with us. This is the one I think we've needed to hear the most as a church. I think we've needed to hear the power and understand the power of our words and the things that we speak, because we can deliver life and death with our words. Now, you may not believe me. You may feel like that's a little bit extreme to say that life and death can come from our words. To compare our words to nuclear reactions may feel a bit extreme. But I'd ask you to consider a little bit of Scripture and a little bit of your own personal experience. So Proverbs 18:21 says these words, that the tongue has the power of life and death, and that those who love it will eat its fruit. The Scriptures are not unclear on the power of your tongue. It has the power of life, and it has the power of death. And that is significant power that God has given your tongue. And if you're not convinced yet, I'd ask you to consider, have you ever had a person in your life who regularly spoke life into you? Who took their words and gave you life with their words? Have you ever had that? Have you ever experienced that? You know, maybe you've had a person in your life who just has been a consistent encourager. They just have always found a way to kind of put wind in your sails and lift you up and encourage you. Man, if you've had a friend like that, that's a friend you want to hang on to for life. Maybe at some point, if you were really fortunate, you worked for a boss who was like that. At some point in your journey, maybe you had a supervisor or a boss who that was the way they were. They weren't your constant critic. They weren't constantly on your back. They were constantly giving you words of affirmation, lifting you up, encouraging you, telling you how good of a job you're doing. And when you've worked for a boss like that, or you work for an organization like that, that's a boss you don't ever want to leave. It almost doesn't matter how much money you make in a job like that. When you work for a person who is an encourager, it's a person you never want to leave. This is the power of words of life. I have a relationship in my life with a guy who is a constant encourager to me, and his name is Robin Wood. Now, you may have heard Robin speak before. Robin is my church planting coach, and he's been with me the last 3 years on this journey of starting Pathway Community Church. And Robin is also overseeing our capital campaign. So he's helping us as a church to raise lots of money to try to get into a position to be able to do something big, buy land or buy a building and renovate that building. We're trying to figure out a big step as a church to be able to move forward into. Robin's working on that with us. Now, I met Robin 3 years ago at a Red Lobster in Muncie, Indiana. I had reached out to his church to ask for funding for our church plant, and the church, the pastor didn't meet with me in the first meeting. He kind of pushed me off to Robin. But I'm so glad he did, because the first time I ever sat down with my friend Robin, it was across the table in this Red Lobster, and I'm not sure I have ever walked out of a meeting as encouraged I did that first time I was around him. Robin just spoke words of life into my soul. I mean, he just poured life into me at that Red Lobster meeting. He told me how effective I was going to be as a planter, how I was uniquely wired in my personality and gift set to do this. He talked to me about my spiritual gifts and just injected hope into me and kind of said just like, I believe in you, I believe in you, I believe in you. I've never in my life walked out of a meeting as encouraged as I was that first time that Robin Wood spoke to me. Now, he started out as my coach, but it didn't take long for us to really transition into a friendship. And Robin and I now, even though he's the age of my parents, Robin now has really become a very, very close friend. We get on the phone probably once a week, once every other week. Some of our phone calls are long, some are short. But I've never had a phone call in 3 years where I walked out discouraged. Every time, Robin has breathed life into me. Now, you need a friend like that in your life. That's the power of positive spoken words. When you get someone like this in your life, there's someone you don't let go of. There's someone you don't let out of your life because they give life to you all the time. Can you imagine if your words gave life to people in that way? But you see, if you've been on the other side, the receiving end of positive words that have helped you, you've also probably been on the receiving end of words of death that have taken life from you, haven't you? Let me just get real kind of raw and honest with you for just a second here. Some of you have been in marriages where your spouse didn't speak words of life. They spoke words of death. They criticized and they cut you down with the sword and they stabbed you with their words, and maybe that marriage didn't survive because of it. Some of you grew up in environments where you had a parent who consistently spoke words of death over you instead of words of life into you. And where your life was just constantly being poured on like these negative words. You could never live up to a standard. You could never do things good enough. Things were always bad. Things were always a failure. And if you grew up in that environment as a child, you know that that carried with you into your adult years. Like those words of death stuck with you for a long, long time. This is why I say that God's word is not unclear on the power of your words. And in every day of your life, there is a spiritual battle that plays out. I've been telling you in this series that there's this invisible world that impacts our visible world. We've kind of used that line throughout the whole series here. And I've told you that God and the devil are at war constantly together. The angels and demons are at war constantly together. And while we can't see everything happening and playing out in the spiritual world, it very much affects our lives in this world. And there is a battle raging over who is going to have control of the nuclear reactors inside of our mouths. Because if God can grab our tongues and bring our tongues under the control of the Spirit of God, then He can use our tongues to speak life and breathe life into people. But if the devil and his demons can continue to tempt us and cause us to give up control of our tongues and our words to him, then the devil can use our words to destroy us and destroy the people around us. This is a big deal. Who has control of your tongue is a big deal and an important question. And it's important to give control over your words to the Spirit of God. Now, James in our New Testament writes a bit about this. Let me give you a little context to the book of James. James is the brother of Jesus. Now, several thousand years ago, when Jesus had gone through his whole ministry, he had been crucified on the cross. He had risen from the dead after his crucifixion. He had stayed on earth for 40 days before he ascended to his Father in heaven. And after all that happened, the early church, the first century church, was looking for leadership. And they looked to James to be their leader, because James was the brother of Jesus. So he kind of had clout and authority by virtue of the fact that he was Jesus' brother. Now, one of the arguments we have that I just always find humorous of why we can believe that Jesus is who the Scriptures say he is, the reason why we can believe he is the Son of God and he did rise from the dead, is because James believed it. What would your brother have to do to convince you that he's the Son of God? James believed that his own brother was the Son of God and that his own brother had risen from the dead. That's evidence right there that Jesus is everything that we're told that he is in the Scriptures. But James writes to the early church, and he writes about the power of the tongue. And he says these words. He said, when we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, James says, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. And consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. Now, James, in this passage, compares our tongues to use an illustration, comparing them to some of the biggest things that he knew at his time. So he talks about horses and ships. Now, in James's day, James had not been exposed to a nuclear reaction. That didn't come until 1938. He didn't know anything about that. But some of the biggest things he knew in the world in his day were horses and ships. And so he starts with a horse. And he says, consider horses. They're big and powerful animals. I mean, horses are some of the strongest animals on earth, right? I mean, horses have been used in battle, and horses are used to plow fields. And in James's day, you didn't just like have horses in a barn and let the kids kind of ride around inside of a fenced area with them. In James's day, if you wanted to win a war, you got horses because they pulled chariots and they moved you into battle and you rode them in to fight victoriously. Horses were a big deal. And so James says, I want you to consider a big and a powerful horse. Think of how strong a horse is. And he said, we can move a horse by putting something very small in its mouth called a bit. And if we'll put that bit into the mouth of a horse, then we can pull the reins to the right or to the left, and that horse will move wherever we want it or need it to go. That horse will move in the direction that we choose because of the power of the bit in its mouth. James says in the same way, your tongue is just a little part of your body, but it moves your whole life in a particular direction. Then he goes on and he talks about ships. Now in James's day, James didn't have gigantic like Disney cruise liners like we do today with, tennis courts on them and swimming pools. But James still saw big ships, and in James's day, ships were some of the biggest things that had ever been created by human beings. Some of the greatest creations on earth were ships. And James said, I want you to think about a ship out in the open seas, a ship that is sailing the seas. How do we move that ship? We take this very small thing called a rudder. We put it on the back. And if we move the rudder one way or the direction, the whole ship turns because of the small rudder. James says in the same way, your tongue is such a small part of your body. But it can move your whole life. And James goes on and he says it like this. He describes the power of the tongue, and he describes it in terms that are almost like unbelievable. I mean, when you hear how he describes the tongue, you go, come on, James, doesn't that feel a little too over the top to speak in the power of the tongue in this way? He says, verse 6, he says, the tongue also is a fire. He says that it's a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. James says that the tongue is actually set on fire by hell. Now, you listen to that and you go, come on, James, isn't that extreme? Isn't that over the top to say that the tongue is set on fire by hell? But James says, just think of how a forest fire can rage because of a small spark. You throw out a small spark and a massive fire can rage and blaze. The tongue has the same power. It has the power to speak life, or it has the power to speak death. So, Pathway, I ask you, who has control of your tongue? Does the Spirit of God have control of your tongue? Or does the devil have control of your tongue? Do the words that come out of your mouth glorify and honor God, or do they bring death to people? If you've been around people who speak death with their words, you know what this is like. I told you a story just a moment ago about my friend Robin Wood and the life that he spoke into me, but that hasn't always been my story. I've certainly been on the receiving end of words of death as well. I wish everybody in my world was as encouraging as my friend Robin, but not everybody is. I remember when I was a campus minister, I was working at California University of Pennsylvania, working with college students, and we would have like a Wednesday night gathering that was kind of like a church service for students. We'd get a bunch of students in a room, and a couple students would be up front, they'd play a guitar. They weren't nearly as good as the Pathway band, but they were learning, they were developing. And then I'd get up and I'd speak, or a local pastor from the area would speak. And our ministry one year was going really, really well. It was really humming along and going well. And there was a girl in our ministry, and I'm going to call her Sarah. It's not her real name. I don't know if she'll ever watch us or hear this message. I don't want to shame her and embarrass her, but there's a girl that we're going to call Sarah. And Sarah had some real problems. Now, we would get maybe 40 or 50 college students who would come into this room every Wednesday night, and Sarah would come in, and week after week after week, one semester, she was a sophomore in college, everything went wrong in her life. I mean, severely wrong. People in her family got cancer. People in her family died. Like, people close to her died tragically. Her life, for about an 8-week span, felt like the story of Job. If you know the story of Job in the Old Testament, where Job goes through this really horrific life experience of losing his whole family, that's what Sarah's story felt like. And she was coming in every week with these stories of just disaster happening. And students would gather around her, we'd lay hands on her, we'd pray over her, try to encourage her. Well, there was a volunteer in our ministry, and her name was Lacey. And Lacey was a real good friend, and Lacey worked on the campus. She worked at the university. And she liked to pour into the young ladies and invest in the young ladies in our ministry. And Lacey came to me one week, and she said, Ryan, she said, I hate to bring this up, but I'm having trouble believing that the stories Sarah is telling are true. Like, I'm just having trouble believing them, and I want to believe her, and they're just so outrageous. Could you come with me to meet with Sarah, and could we ask her to just give us some kind of evidence of what she's saying is true so we can really be in support of her, not have to, like, check ourselves on this, not have to wonder if this is real. And so we got to the end of that first semester, it was the fall semester, and it was mid-December, right before all the students were going to go on Christmas break, and Lacey and I sat down with Sarah. And we approached her in the most gracious way we possibly could and said, Sarah, could you show us some evidence that what you're saying is true? We want to be in support of you. I mean, truly did this in the most gracious way we knew how. And Sarah said, well, let's have a meeting when I get back, and I'll show you that this is true. What I didn't know at the time is that Sarah had made every story up. Every single one of them. Every story of tragedy in her family, every story of death around her was a lie. It wasn't actually true. I didn't know that at the time. You know, looking back now, I think that Sarah probably had a very, very severe mental illness, would be my guess, and what was going on in her life. I don't know why she would have lied on that level, but I think there was something really significant going on in her life. But what happened was we went into Christmas break, and so all the students were gone from campus for a month. When I got back to campus in early January, I had no idea what had happened over the month, like mid-December to mid-January, while we were gone. What I didn't realize was that Sarah had gone around, because she was angry at us now that we had brought this up, that maybe this wasn't true. She had gone around to students all over our ministry and told really vicious lies about me. And so I get back onto campus, and like I have a total rebellion of students on my hands. I've got students firing me angry, I mean aggressive, angry text messages. I'm getting angry emails from students. I'm getting phone calls from students that are screaming at me on the phone. I've got people yelling at me in my face, telling me they're done, they're leaving the ministry, they're never coming back. And I'm going, what in the heck happened here? What happened here? Well, you see, what had happened was when Sarah had begun to tell her lies about me, she went to one student and she tells a lie and tells a story, and then another student tells a lie, tells a story. And the students did what we always have a temptation to do. They took a juicy piece of gossip, and without vetting it on any level to say, is this true, they took it right on and passed it to the next person. And that person now has a juicy piece of gossip. And they take it right on and they pass it to the next person. And they pass it to the next person. And the chain reaction begins. And it felt like a nuclear weapon had been deployed in our ministry. We almost lost our ministry over this. It got so bad that we had to go to the faculty advisor who oversaw our student ministry. He was a Christian guy, a fantastic guy, and we had to bring him in, and he had to try to gather all these students, and many that would be willing to listen, into a room and set the record straight and tell them that their friend Sarah had been making this all up. I mean, it was emotional, and there were tears, but so much damage had been done. We literally lost almost a year of ministry. Like, we lost our entire spring semester of what could have been vibrant ministry to students because of lies and gossip. And this is the problem with the tongue. Because while the tongue can be used to give life, the tongue can be used to encourage, the tongue can be used to lift people up, the tongue can also be used to lie, deceive, destroy, gossip, slander. The tongue can be used for evil. Which is why I'm telling you that every day of your life, you walk around with this nuclear reactor. Your tongue is like a nuclear reactor in your mouth. Every day you get to decide if it gives life or takes life. You get to make that decision. You need to bring your tongue under the control of the Spirit of God so God can use it to give life. Pathway, when I look at what's going on with our church, I need you to know that I can see some things when I kind of step back and I look over the scope of our church. I can see some things that are going incredibly well, and I can see some things we really need to work on. And from my vantage point where I stand as the pastor, when I look at our church, I'm super encouraged by what is happening. We've been growing. We've become much more financially healthy than we ever were before. We used to kind of be in financial crisis. We're not there anymore because of the generosity and the tithes and offerings of members of our church. We've got a solid leadership structure in place. I'm not going anywhere. We have an excellent staff team who are working with me, really, really solid staff. Like when I look at our church, I just see the possibility for a runway of growth to eventually reach thousands of people in this valley. And I sincerely, in my heart of hearts, believe that's where God is taking our church. And so when I look at our church, the threat that I see is not money, it's not leadership, it's not our volunteer base, it's not our facilities, it's none of that. The threat that I see to our church, are you ready for this? Is right here. It's our tongues. Our greatest threat against us is whether or not we're going to be a culture that speaks life or speaks death with the use of our words. That's our top threat. You want to know why? Because you can have the greatest band in a world in a church. You can have the greatest communicator in a world in a pastor or a speaker. You can have awesome volunteer teams and guest services. But if you've got a culture where gossip flows and slander is spoken and evil words are spoken and people slash each other down with the sword and use their words to give death to people, you cannot overcome that. The greatest band and the greatest communicator and all the money in the bank account in the world cannot overcome a culture that's a culture of death being spoken off of our tongues. Nothing can overcome that. But at the same time, if you have a life-giving culture, a culture that speaks words of life into each other, I don't care how bad your band is, or your communicator is, or your bank accounts are, you're going to grow, and you won't be able to stop it. And look out for what God is going to do. You know, one of my dreams for our church is that we would be a church that would have a culture that would say, you know, we are not going to participate in gossip and slander, cutting each other down. We're just not going to do it. So that when you're talking to somebody and that a potential piece of gossip comes to you, my dream is that our reaction, that our culture would be one of such say, hey, whoa, whoa, whoa. Hey, come on now. We're Pathway. We don't do that. Or if you're standing in a circle with people from our church and somebody's not in that circle and their name comes up and somebody else starts to bring a negative kind of a slanderous comment, that our answer would be, hey, whoa, 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 whoa. This is Pathway. We don't do that here. You see, Pathway, I'm telling you that if we choose to use our words for good, if we choose to use our words, allow our words to come under the power of the Spirit of God, to breathe life, to encourage, to uplift, to empathize with people, if we use our words that when people are down and out, we don't come in with the swords to take them out at the knees. No, we come in with loving and kind words to lift them up. If that's our culture, then I'm telling you, look out. We will not be able to hold people out of this church. Because people can smell the life or the death 100 miles away in a church, can't they? People come into a church and it's a word that they're just, death is being spoken. They can feel it the moment they walk in the door. But when people come in the church, and it's a culture that's giving life, it's a culture that's breathing life into people. Listen to me now, Pathway. Come on. You can't keep people out. You can't keep people out of a church like that. And we're going to watch our church grow and reach people in this valley on a scale that none of us could imagine. If we will choose that kind of culture and choose to bring our tongues under the control of the Spirit of God. So, Pathway, here's how we're going to wrap this message up. We're going to stand on our feet in just a second and have a little bit of call and response together. Now, some of you grew up, in like liturgical churches where you kind of did a back and forth and a call and response. And we're going to do a little bit of that this morning to close out. So everybody up on your feet, come on. I'm going to lead you in a prayer, and I want you to pray the words after me. Like I'm going to speak a portion of the prayer, and I want you to speak those same words back to me. Can you do that? Come on, that's not nearly enough energy. Can you do that? Come on now. We're going to pray a prayer over our tongue. So here we go. Lord Jesus. Come on. Lord Jesus, give it to me. There it is. Now you're getting it. Today I decide to use my tongue for good. It will speak life and not death. It will not pass on gossip, will not slander, and will not lie. It will not be a tool the devil's use. My tongue will encourage, uplift, empathize, and evangelize. My tongue will worship God and bless His people. From this day forward, my tongue will be harnessed for good. Amen.